Welcome to our next presentation in the 2017 CSGA Rules of Golf Workshops. In this presentation, we'll be discussing three separate rules: Rule 6, the player, Rule 11, teeing ground, and Rule 21, cleaning the ball. Now let's get started with Rule 6, the player. You can see several of the definitions that will appear throughout Rule 6. They'll also appear in Rule 33 as well. Rule 6-1, the player and his caddy are responsible for knowing the rules. During a stipulated round, for any breach of a rule by his caddy, the player incurs the applicable penalty. Rule 6-2 for handicaps. Part A is match play. Before starting a match in a handicap competition, the players should determine from one another their respective handicaps. If a player begins the match having declared a handicap higher than that to which he is entitled, and this affects the number of strokes given or received, he is disqualified. Otherwise, the player must play off the declared handicap. Now, what do we mean by otherwise? Well, otherwise in this case could mean that the player declared the correct handicap, and in that case he would play off of that handicap. Otherwise can also mean that a player declares a lower handicap. So if a player is a 6 handicap but mistakenly says he's a 5, well, in that case the player would play to a 5. Also, option 3 here for otherwise would be if a player declares a higher handicap but does not affect the number of strokes given or received. So in this case, if a player declares a higher handicap but that does not impact the number of strokes given to his opponent or received by the player, then the player would play off of that handicap. Now 6-2B for stroke play. In any round of a handicap competition, the competitor must ensure that his handicap is recorded on his scorecard before it is returned to the committee. If no handicap is recorded on the scorecard before it is returned, or if the recorded handicap is higher than that to which he is entitled, and this affects the number of strokes received, he is disqualified from the handicap competition. Otherwise, the score stands. You can see here just a slight distinction saying he is disqualified from the handicap competition, because if it is a competition that's played both gross and net, so with handicaps and without, he would not be disqualified for the entire competition, just the handicap portion of the competition. There is a note to this rule that it is the player's responsibility to know the holes at which handicap strokes are given or received. So as you can see here in this match between these two players, you can see the stroke holes highlighted in yellow. Now, it would be the player's responsibility to know at which holes the handicap strokes are given. Now Rule 6-3 is time of starting, and players must start at the time established by the committee. A penalty for breach of this rule has been changed in the last couple rule cycles. But if the player arrives at his starting point ready to play within 5 minutes after his starting time, the penalty for failure to start on time is loss of the first hole in match play or 2 strokes at the first hole in stroke play. So Rule 6-3 is going to give you some allowance as to what time you start. However, if you do start after the time the committee has established, but it's within a 5-minute window after that time, then you are going to receive a loss of hole in match play or a 2-stroke penalty on the first hole in stroke play. Now otherwise, the penalty for breach of this rule is disqualification. And what do we mean here by otherwise? Well, otherwise would mean if the player arrives more than 5 minutes late or arrives within 5 minutes but is not ready to play within that 5-minute time. There's a slight distinction in here between bogey and par competitions and Stableford competitions, which we will get to in later presentations. Again, there is an exception to this rule. that where the committee determines that exceptional circumstances have prevented a player from starting on time, there is no penalty. Rule 6-3B talks about groupings. In stroke play, the competitor must remain throughout the round in the group arranged by the committee, unless the committee authorizes or ratifies a change. The penalty for breach of this rule is disqualification. So if a player is in a threesome that's behind a twosome and the twosome is playing quite slow and one player wants to move up into the group in front of them to help speed up their pace of play for some reason, that player would be in breach of Rule 6-3B, and that penalty would be disqualification. For best ball and four ball play, which we'll get to in later presentations, see Rules 30-3A and 31-2. But for 30-3, just briefly, it's going to say that a side may be represented by one partner for all or any part of the match, and all partners do not need to be present. And same thing for 31-2 and four ball stroke play, a side may be represented by either partner for all or any part of the stipulated round. 6-4 talks about the caddy. Player may be assisted by a caddy, but he is limited to only one caddy at any one time.
What the hell?
Come on, good. Now we're just worried about putting, huh?
Oh, yeah, plenty.
All right, remember what I said, huh? Just use your shoulders to push the ball, not your arms. Don't break the wrist, and bring that putter back just like...
You're confusing me. Just let me put the ball in the hole.
All right.
So as you can see in that brief video, another one from Happy Gilmore, he actually has the young caddy there carrying his clubs, carrying his towel for him, while his coach is walking alongside also handling the clubs. And in that case, he would be having two caddies at one time, and therefore would be in breach of Rule 6-4. Now, a penalty for this, in match play, it's going to be an adjustment penalty. So at the conclusion of the hole at which the breach is discovered, the state of the match is adjusted by deducting one hole for each hole at which the breach occurred, and there's a maximum deduction per round of 2 holes. So in this case, if you have 2 caddies at a time during the play of a hole in match play, it is not a loss of hole penalty. The players would complete the play of that hole, and then at the conclusion of the hole, there would be that adjustment. Now in stroke play, penalty will be 2 strokes for each hole at which the breach occurred, and again a maximum penalty per round will be 4 strokes, 2 strokes at each of the first 2 holes at which any breach occurred. If a breach is discovered between the play of 2 holes, it is deemed to have been discovered during play of the next hole, and the penalty must be applied accordingly. Also, a player having more than one caddy in breach of this rule must immediately, upon the discovery of that breach, ensure that he has no more than one caddy at any time during the remainder of the stipulated round. Otherwise, the player is disqualified. So once the player becomes aware that he had 2 caddies, he cannot again during that stipulated round employ 2 caddies. Otherwise, there's also a note here, and as you can see on the right, this is a picture from the U.S. Junior Amateur, and the committee may, in the conditions of competition, prohibit the use of caddies or restrict a player in his choice of a caddy. So in this case, for the U.S. Junior Amateur, they restrict the players in their choice of a caddy, so a parent or a guardian cannot caddy for a player during U.S. Junior Amateur, and also in several other high school tournaments, college tournaments, they do prohibit the use of caddies in general. Rule 6-5 is the golf ball. the responsibility for playing the proper ball rests with the player. Each player should put an identification mark on his ball. So this is not a requirement. The rules do say the player should. So we're telling a player that they should do that. They don't have to do it. It's not a requirement, but it is good practice to put a mark on your golf ball. Now, Rule 6-6, scoring and stroke play. This rule has been modified in the last rule cycle, so we'll go through it a little bit more in depth. Rule 6-6A is recording scores. After each hole, the marker should check the score with the competitor and record it. So it's not a requirement that they check with the competitor and record it right away, but it is good practice to do so. On completion of the round, the marker must sign the card and hand it to the competitor. So the marker does have to sign, test the scorecard, and hand it to the competitor. If more than one marker records the scores, each must sign for the part at which he is responsible. So if for some reason your marker withdraws after 9 holes due to an injury or poor play, and someone else marks your scores for the remainder of the round, the first person that withdrew your original marker would have to sign for the first 9 holes in which they kept your score, and then the other marker would have to also sign for the scores for the second 9 holes. 6-6B, after completion of the round, the competitor should check his scores for each hole and settle any doubtful points with the committee. So again, this is not a must, it's a should, but if the player does not do this, then there could be ramifications later on, as we'll see as we get further into this rule. Now the player must ensure that the marker or markers have signed the scorecard, sign the scorecard himself, and return it to the committee as soon as possible. So this is not a should, this is a must. The player must ensure that the marker has signed the scorecard, that he himself has signed the scorecard, and must return it to the committee as soon as possible. Penalty for this rule, 6-6B, is disqualification. Rule 6-6C is alteration of scorecard. It says that no alteration may be made on a scorecard after the competitor has returned it to the committee. So in this case, this was Billy Mayfair at a USGA championship. He's saying, I returned my scorecard earlier and I think I made a mistake. So once that scorecard has been returned to the committee, no alteration on the scorecard may be made. Rule 6-6D is a wrong score for a hole. The competitor is responsible for the correctness of the score recorded for each hole on his scorecard. If he returns a score for any hole lower than actually taken, he is disqualified. And as you can see here on the right, this is Betsy Rawls and Jackie Pung in the 1957 U.S. Women's Open. Pung, who was the winner, was the apparent winner, was disqualified on her final round for signing for a 5 on the 4th hole instead of a 6. And if the player returns a score for any hole higher than actually taken, the score as returned stands. This is a picture of Roberto DiVincenzo at the 1968 Masters. He actually signed for a score on one hole that was higher than he actually had taken, and therefore that score stood, and therefore he lost out on the opportunity for a playoff in the Masters. Now this is part of the rules change that just recently occurred. There is an exception to this, that if a competitor returns a score for any hole lower than actually taken due to the failure to include one or more penalty strokes that before returning his scorecard he did not know he had incurred, he is not disqualified. The competitor incurs the penalty prescribed by the applicable rule and an additional penalty of 2 strokes for each hole at which the competitor has committed a breach of Rule 6-6D. And this exception does not apply when the applicable penalty is disqualification from the competition. So as we saw in an earlier video of the Tournament of Champions several years ago, Camilo Villegas, chips his ball up a slope and it's coming back towards him. He removes some loose impediments in the area at which the ball is likely to come to rest, which is a penalty. He did return his scorecard, and at the time, this rule had not been changed, and therefore he returned his scorecard with a score lower than what he had actually been entitled to due to the penalty. Now, with this change, and this exception being made in Rule 6-6D, he actually would not be disqualified from the competition. However, he would include the penalty on that hole for removing those loose impediments, and he would also incur a 2-stroke penalty under Rule 6-6D. There is a note to Rule 6-6. The committee is responsible for the addition of scores and the application of the handicap recorded on the scorecard. And also, Note 2 and 4-ball stroke play, which we'll get to, we'll review Rule 31-3 and 7A. Rule 6-7 is undue delay or slow play. The player must play without undue delay and in accordance with any pace of play guidelines that the committee may establish. Between completion of a hole and playing from the next teeing ground, the player must not unduly delay play.
Hey! While we're young?
He thinks it's a major.
We're helping to pick up the pace. See what you can do at usga.org.
No respect.
Now that was just a brief clip from the USGA's Pace of Play campaign a couple of years ago. I would recommend that you do review some of those videos. They're quite entertaining and do point out some of the aspects of slow play that we can all benefit from. So under Rule 6-7, the breach of this rule for match play is loss of hole. Stroke play is 2 strokes. And then for bogey, par, Stableford competitions, we'll see the Note 2 to Rule 32, 1A and 1B. And that's for the first breach. For any subsequent offense, that's disqualification. So that's the standard penalty structure. Match play, loss of hole, stroke play, 2 strokes for the first offense, and any subsequent offense would be disqualification. Now, Note 1 under this rule, if a player unduly delays play between holes, he is delaying the play of the next hole, and except for bogey, par, and Stableford competitions, which we'll cover in Rule 32, the penalty applies to that hole. So undue delay between the play of 2 holes, the penalty applies to the following hole. Also, and an important note, which most likely is adopted at most clubs and state, regional, and national championships as well, that for the purpose of preventing slow play, the committee may, in the conditions of competitions, establish pace of play guidelines, including maximum periods of time allowed to complete a stipulated round, stroke, or hole. In match play, the committee may, in such condition, modify the penalty for breach of this rule as follows. So whereas we said the standard breach was a loss of hole for your first offense and your subsequent offense was disqualification, the committee may modify the breach of the penalties to be first offense, a loss of hole, a second offense, loss of hole, and then for any subsequent offense would be disqualification. Now in stroke play, the committee again may modify the penalty structure for this, and in this case the first offense would be 1 stroke, second offense 2 strokes, and for subsequent offense disqualification. So just make sure you note those changes. Those are things that are often asked on any test questions, that the difference between if the committee has adopted a local rule or pace of play that has modified the general penalty statements under this rule. And again, those penalties would be loss of hole and match play or 2 strokes in stroke play, and any subsequent offense would be disqualification, with the adjustment penalties in match play being loss of hole, and then disqualification. And in stroke play, a first offense would be 1 stroke, second offense 2 strokes, and subsequent offense is disqualification. Now, Rule 6-8 is discontinuance of play and resumption of play. We're going to get into 4 different parts of this: when it's permitted, the procedure when play is suspended by the committee, lifting your ball when play is discontinued, and the procedure when play is resumed. Rule 6-8A, players must not discontinue play unless the committee has suspended play. That's your first option. You must not discontinue unless the committee has suspended play.
Did you see that?
Miracle, eh? Nice shot, Bishop. You must have made a deal with the devil.
Yeah, I could break the club record theoretically.
Better come in until this blows over.
Well, what do you think, fella? I keep playing. I don't think the heavy stuff's going to come down for quite a while.
You're right. Anyway, the good Lord would never disrupt the best game of my life.
So as you can see in that video from Caddyshack, the committee is obviously not required the discontinuance of play, and therefore it's up to the bishop to decide, and he wants to continue playing. Player must not discontinue play also unless he is seeking a decision from the committee on a doubtful or disputed point. So that's under Rule 2-5 for doubt as to procedure in match play, or Rule 34-3 in the absence of a referee. Player must not also discontinue play unless there is some other good reason, such as sudden illness. Now, bad weather is not of itself a good reason for discontinuing play. Now, if a player discontinues play without specific permission from the committee, he must report to the committee as soon as practicable. So as you can see down below, the player must not discontinue play unless the committee has suspended play. So unless the committee has suspended play, those are some other reasons that the player would discontinue his play. Now, in that case, he must report the facts to the committee. So if a player believes there's danger from lightning, or is he seeking a decision from a committee on a doubtful or disputed point, or there's some other good reason such as sudden illness, reporting the discontinuance of play in that case would be required. Now, if a player does so and the committee considers his reason satisfactory, there is no penalty. Otherwise, the player is disqualified. So here on the right, the player stopped for lunch. They're discontinuing play. That would not be a good reason to stop, and therefore the players would be disqualified. So again, otherwise here is going to mean that the committee does not think the reason the players discontinued play was satisfactory. There is an exception in match play. The players discontinuing match play by agreement are not subject to disqualification unless by doing so the competition is delayed. So players can agree that, it's say here on the right, it's getting really nasty out here, let's stop for an hour. Now if this doesn't delay the competition by any means, so if this is a match play bracket at a club that's played over several weeks or several months and the players are just required to finish their match by a certain date, then they would have the option here, since they would not be delaying the competition, to stop and wait for the weather to pass. There's another note here that leaving the course does not of itself constitute discontinuance of play. So a player could possibly run out to the parking lot to get a replacement putter or driver or something out of his car that the player might need, and leaving the course does not constitute discontinuance of play. Rule 6-8B, the procedure when play is suspended by the committee. When play is suspended by the committee, if the players in the match or group are between the play of 2 holes, they must not resume play until the committee has ordered a resumption of play. If they have started play of the hole, they may discontinue play immediately or continue play of the hole provided they do not do so without delay. the players choose to continue play of the hole, they are permitted to discontinue play before completing it. In any case, play must be discontinued after the hole is completed. Players must resume play when the committee has ordered a resumption of play. Penalty for this rule is disqualification. Now, a note here, the committee may provide in the conditions of competition that in potentially dangerous situations, play must be discontinued immediately following a suspension of play by the committee. So unless noted in the conditions of competition, the players would always have the option to finish out the hole when the committee suspends play. However, the committee adopts the condition of competition, which most clubs and state, regional, national championships do. There's a different procedure when a dangerous situation arises and the committee suspends play. In this case, if a player fails to discontinue play immediately, he would be disqualified unless circumstances warrant waiving such a penalty as provided in 33.7. We'll get into what Rule 33 and 33.7, the committee's responsibilities and their option to waive a penalty. Rule 6-8C, when a player discontinues play of a hole under Rule 6-8A, he may lift his ball without penalty only if the committee has suspended play, or if there is good reason to lift it. Before lifting the ball, the player must mark its position. As you can see here to the right, committee has suspended play. There's standing water on the golf course. Player puts several tees in the ground and lifts his golf ball. So you can see a nice little chart here. You're going to have on the left when the player may always lift the ball and when the player must have good reason to lift the ball. And again, we're going to get back into when a player must not discontinue play. Must not discontinue play unless, in the first case, the committee has suspended play. So if the committee has suspended play, the player may always lift the ball, and if he does so, the ball must be marked prior to the lifting. Those other three situations that we talked about before, believes there's danger from lightning or seeking a decision, or there's some other good reason such as sudden illness, the player must have good reason to lift the ball at the time. The player discontinues play and lifts his ball without specific permission from the committee. He must, when reporting to the committee, report the lifting of the ball. So again, in those other three situations, the player decides to discontinue play. He must inform the committee that he discontinued play, and if he lifts the golf ball in those cases, he must also report the lifting of the ball to the committee. If the player lifts the ball without a good reason to do so, fails to mark the position of the ball before lifting it, or fails to report the lifting of the ball, the player incurs a one-stroke penalty. Now 6-8D, procedure when play is resumed. Play must be resumed from where it was discontinued, even if the resumption occurs on a subsequent day. The player must, either before or when play is resumed, proceed as follows. If the player has lifted the ball, he must, provided he was entitled to lift it under Rule 6-8C, place the original ball or a substituted ball on the spot from which the original ball was lifted. Otherwise, the original ball must be replaced. If the player has not lifted his ball, he may, provided he was entitled to lift it, he may lift, clean, and replace the ball or substitute a ball on the spot from which the original ball was lifted. Before lifting the ball, he must mark its position. There is a third one in here. If the player's ball or ball marker is moved, including by wind or water, while play is discontinued, a ball or ball marker must be placed on the spot from which the original ball or ball marker was moved. Now there is a note to this rule that if the spot where the ball is to be placed is impossible to be determined, it must be estimated and the ball placed on the estimated spot. The provisions of Rule 20-3C do not apply. We'll get into Rule 20 in a later presentation, but 23C outlines the parameters for what happens when a spot is not determinable. And in that case, those provisions do not apply, And when, in this case, upon resumption of play, if the spot is impossible to be determined, it must be estimated and the ball placed on the estimated spot. A penalty for breach of Rule 6-8D in match play is loss of hole, and in stroke play is 2 strokes. And if a player incurs the general penalty for a breach of Rule 6-8D, there is no additional penalty under Rule 6-8C. So in this case, we will have 1 plus the general penalty equals the general penalty. So we're going to move on to Rule 11 for the teeing ground. There's 5 parts to this rule, but it's a lot less complex than the previous rule that we just talked about. Some of the following terms and definitions that will appear throughout Rule 11. 11-1, when a player is putting a ball into play from the teeing ground, it must be played from within the teeing ground and from the surface of the ground or from a conforming tee, in or on the surface of the ground. For the purposes of this rule, the surface of the ground includes an irregularity of surface, whether or not created by the player, and sand or other natural substance, whether or not placed by the player. So that's an internal definition of surface of the ground, as you can see on the left and the right. Although the ball on the right is on sand or another natural substance, that would also be considered on the surface of the ground. If a player makes a stroke at a ball on a non-conforming tee, or at a ball teed in a manner not permitted by this rule, he is disqualified. So you can see on the right, there's a player has taken a tee and put another tee on it, and that's not a conforming tee. And also you have one of those non-slice or non-draw tees. Those are also non-conforming, and therefore you would be disqualified if you played a stroke at a ball from one of those tees. A player may stand outside the teeing ground to play a ball within it. Very similar to the definition of out of bounds. A player may stand out of bounds to hit a ball that lies in bounds. So in this case, the same premise, that a player may stand outside the teeing ground to play a ball within it. 11-2 talks about tee markers. Before a player makes his first stroke with any ball on the teeing ground of the hole being played, the tee markers are deemed to be fixed. So those tee markers cannot be moved before a player makes his first stroke with any ball on the teeing ground of the hole being played. In these circumstances, if the player moves or allows to be moved a tee marker for the purpose of avoiding interference with his stance, the area of intended swing, or his line of play, he incurs the penalty for a breach of Rule 13-2. So you can see here, player took the tee marker, which is fixed prior to his first stroke on the teeing ground, and moved it because he wanted to stand on that spot. In that case, the player would be in breach of Rule 13-2. 11-3 is ball falling off a tee. If a ball, when not in play, falls off a tee or is knocked off the tee by a player in addressing it, it may be reteed without penalty. So you can see here the player accidentally, while addressing the ball, knocks it off the tee. Now that's not a stroke, and the ball may be reteed without penalty. However, if a stroke is made at the ball in these circumstances, whether the ball is moving or not, the stroke counts, but there is no penalty. So if you have a ball on a tee and you start making your stroke at the golf ball and the ball falls off the tee and you miss the ball in the process of making the stroke would count, but there is no penalty. Now 11-4 talks about playing from outside the teeing ground, and in match play, if a player, when starting the play of a hole, plays a ball from outside the teeing ground, there is no penalty. However, the opponent may immediately require the player to cancel the stroke and play a ball from within the teeing ground. So in that case, a player plays from outside the teeing ground. it's now within the opponent's rights to immediately require the player to cancel and replay the stroke, or he may allow the player to continue play of the hole with that original ball. Now in stroke play, if a competitor when starting play of the hole plays a ball from outside the teeing ground, the player is going to incur a penalty of 2 strokes. Also, the player is required to play a ball from within the teeing ground. So in this case, the player must correct his mistake. If the competitor plays a stroke from the next teeing ground without first correcting the mistake, or in the case of the last hole of the round, leaves the putting green without first declaring his intention to correct his mistake, the player is disqualified. So in this case on the right, you're going to see play for the competition is from the gray tees. The player, however, tees off from the blue tees. So the error may be corrected all the way up until this point, even when he tees a ball up behind the next hole, on the gray tees on the next hole. As soon as he makes a stroke on that ball on the 13th hole from those tees, it is now too late to correct the error, and he would be disqualified. The stroke from outside the teeing ground and any subsequent strokes by the competitor on the hole prior to his correction of the mistake do not count in his score. So when the player in stroke play tees off outside of the teeing ground, that stroke that he makes there, and even if he goes on to hole out, makes several other strokes and hole out and gets to the next teeing ground and realizes he had played from the wrong set of tees on the previous hole, he's going to be required to go back to the previous hole and then play a ball from within the teeing ground and finish out the hole. So any of those strokes made with his first ball on that hole, including his tee shot, do not count, and he would be subject to a 2-stroke penalty. Now 11-5 is playing from a wrong teeing ground, and playing from a wrong teeing ground is just going to say that the provisions of the rule 11-4, which we just talked about, those are going to apply. So in that case, in the diagram we saw before with the blue markers and the gray markers, he played from outside the teeing ground. That's also from a wrong teeing ground, and therefore the provisions of rules 11-4 apply. And in that case, there are 2 common scenarios for that breach, where you have the correct hole with wrong tee markers or the wrong hole with any tee markers. In that case, the player would have to correct his mistake. So some key concepts to Rule 11. The teeing ground, again, under definitions, is the starting place of the hole to be played. 11-1, teeing the ball. There are a variety of acceptable methods. 11-2, tee markers are fixed prior to putting any ball into play. 11-3, if your ball falls off the tee, it may be reteed without penalty. 11-4, you play from outside the teeing ground. There's no penalty in match play, but the opponent may recall your stroke. When in stroke play, there is a 2-stroke penalty. You must correct that error or be subject to disqualification. And then again, 11-5, playing from the wrong teeing ground, just see the provisions in a Rule 11-4. Now Rule 21 is cleaning the ball. Just some of the definitions that will appear, just 2 of them in this case. Now, oftentimes, cleaning the golf ball is something that's very confusing for many golfers and a lot of even rules experts, but they've done a really good job of looking at this rule and putting it all into one place. And the more and more you look at this rule, you realize it's very cut and dry as far as when a ball can be cleaned. Now under Rule 2021, a ball on the putting green may be cleaned when lifted under Rule 16-1B. So when a ball lies on the putting green, the player may lift the ball and clean it. Elsewhere, what do we mean by elsewhere? Well, on the teeing ground, through the green, and in hazards, a ball may be cleaned except when it has been lifted to determine if it is unfit for play under Rule 5-3. for identification under Rule 12-2, in which case it may only be cleaned to the extent necessary for identification, or because it is assisting or interfering with play under Rule 22. Now, if a player cleans his ball during play of the hole, except as provided in this rule, he incurs a penalty of 1 stroke, and the ball, if lifted, must be replaced. If a player who is required to replace a ball fails to do so, he incurs the general penalty under the applicable rule, but there is no additional penalty under Rule 21. So again, we're at the point where it's 1 plus the general penalty equals the general penalty. So if a player breaches a rule and incurs a 2-stroke penalty or a loss of hole in match play, but also cleans his golf ball, at that point the general penalty will absorb the 1-stroke penalty under Rule 21 and would just be the general penalty. There is an exception to this, that if a player incurs a penalty for failing to act in accordance with Rule 5-3, 12-2, or 22, those were the 3 times you could not clean your golf ball, there is no additional penalty under Rule 21. So in this case, a player lifts the ball for identification without first marking it. So in that case, the player is going to be penalized for breach of Rule 12-2. And in that case, there would be no additional penalty under Rule 21. There are key concepts to Rule 21. A ball lifted from the putting green may always be cleaned. And a ball lifted elsewhere under the rules may be cleaned when lifted except in 3 cases. Again, Rule 5-3 to determine if it is unfit for play, Rule 12-2 for identification, and Rule 22 because it is interfering or assisting play. Now this is the point where I like to tell people there's a nice little acronym for this. So if you want to remember UIAI, UIAI, that's the acronym I like to use to determine whether somebody's allowed to clean their golf ball. Now, knowing that there's only 3 cases that you cannot clean your golf ball, then you just know that everywhere else you may clean your golf ball when lifted under the rules. So again, that UIAI is unfit for play, identification, assisting, or interfering. So if you can remember UIAI, you should be all set when knowing when you can clean your ball. The penalty for cleaning when not permitted is 1 stroke, and the penalty is limited to a total of 1 stroke under this rule for those 3 times when you're not allowed to clean your ball. The general penalty, when the general penalty is incurred, when a ball is not replaced, there's going to be no additional penalty for cleaning your ball. So again, 1 plus the general penalty will equal the general penalty. And you can also see decision 20-1/.7 for instances in equity when a lifted ball may not be cleaned. That's going to wrap up our presentation today on Rule 6, Rule 11, and Rule 21. For more information on these presentations and others, please follow along in the library.